Hello and welcome to the react.js for beginner series. In this series, I'll be teaching everything you need to know in order to get started using React. Once you know how to use React, you'll be able to make awesome user interfaces and front-end applications very easily. So before we get into this, make sure to subscribe if you like my content. Now let's get introduced to React. React is a JavaScript library for making front-end applications and user interfaces. So it is a front-end library. So by front-end, I mean that the React code that you write will be executed on the user's browser or the client side instead of the server side. So in a typical Flask or PHP application, the code that you write gets executed on the server, and then the server just renders the page and passes it to the browser, which is really slower, and React doesn't do that, but instead it renders the page on the browser side, which makes it really fast, and it gives it a really good performance. Now React is created and maintained by Facebook, and at the current moment it's the most popular front-end framework. Now why do a lot of people use React? Well, React makes it very easy for you to develop your front-end applications by dividing all of your web page parts into components. It also has a robust component state management, prop system, etc. But don't worry about them for now. We'll be covering these topics later in the series. So sometimes people are confused at something. Even though React is a library, we might hear it being called a framework. And why is that? Because React has so many features and capabilities, sometimes a lot of developers and people like to compare it with a framework, and that's perfectly fine. Now let's talk about why you should learn React. Number one, job opportunities. React is a framework that is used in a lot of big tech companies, including but not limited to Instagram, Netflix, Facebook, etc. So if you know React, it's a great skill to have on your resume, and it'll help you a lot for getting a job in FANG or any other tech industry. Now the second thing is, it's a great skill. React is such an awesome library / framework, and just knowing how to use React is really cool if you're a front-end developer. But if you're also a backend or a full stack developer, React is going to be helpful, because sometimes when you're a backend developer, you might need to write some front-end code in order to test your backend code. So like in order for the front-end to be able to make API requests, you might need to know some front-end. And if you're a full stack developer, well, you need to know both sides. So React is it's a really great skill to learn. Now the third thing is, your front-end life will be easier. And yes, it is true. When you're writing code in something like plain HTML or CSS, let's say you have 5 pages and each page has the same navbar. So in each of your HTML pages, you need to write the same navbar again and again, either copy paste it or just write it from scratch again, which is really hard. Also, maintaining such a huge web page and all of the elements in the page is really hard. But React has a component architecture which basically divides parts of your web page into multiple independent components, and it makes it really easy for you to maintain your front-end application. Now the last thing is, your UI or front-end application is very fluid and performant. Now as I've said before, since your React code is executed and rendered on the browser, unlike any server-sided applications, it is really fast, and React can just make API requests to the backend to render some data or do something. Now let's talk about the concepts in React. Now these concepts might sound a bit intimidating but not complicated to some of you, but I hope that I can explain at least I can just scratch the surface of these concepts, and then we will discuss it in later videos. So let's start with the virtual DOM. Now, a virtual DOM is basically the representation of the real JavaScript DOM, but it is a lightweight representation that React uses in order to match the real DOM and sync up if there are like any changes in the virtual DOM. Now, if you don't know what the JavaScript DOM is, it's basically the document object model, and it's just like a tree of all of the elements in an HTML web page. For example, an h1 inside the div, and then there's like the div is like inside another container div, etc, etc. So that's basically the DOM. Now, the thing that's good with virtual DOM is that when React detects a change in the virtual DOM, it quickly tries to sync it with the real DOM and modifies it in order to do so. This is way faster and easier than manipulating the real DOM, because when you manipulate the real DOM or change it, the JavaScript DOM renders itself again, which is a bit slower, but with the virtual DOM, React doesn't need to render the page again in order to just display a DOM change. Now let's talk about components. Components are at the heart of React. They're basically independent parts of your web page, and you can use them whenever you need to. So for example, when you go to the website, you see a nav bar, you see a footer, the page content, etc, etc. Here, the nav bar is a component, the body is a component, the footer is also a component, etc, etc. So it is very helpful, since you can just write your component once and then use it anywhere you want to and whenever you want to do it. Now, the third thing we need to know is props. Props are a really simple concept. So imagine you're writing a function in programming, in like any programming language, and you might want to pass some data to that function in the form of parameters or arguments. The function will use those data in the form of arguments to run or do something. Now, props are similar in case of React components. In React, props are basically some data that you're passing to the components, and the components can use it to do whatever they want. The components can use it to like render it on the component, or it can make an API request with some data on the props, etc, etc. Now let's talk about state. Now, this concept of state might sound a bit intimidating, but it might sound a bit intimidating to some of you, but if you're experienced in computing or IT, it might be a very easy concept for you. But let me explain. State is basically some information and data that React stores in memory. Now, React does something depending on a condition in the state. So, for example, if the value of this state, if a value in the state is 1, you tell React to render a blue circle, and if the value in the state is 2, you tell it to render a red circle. Now, I know this is not the best example, but I hope that explains what state is and how it is really useful. You can just have some data or some input in the memory, and then you can tell React to do something depending on the values in the state. Now let's talk about JSX. JSX means JavaScript XML. It is really similar to HTML with slight differences, but there aren't a lot of differences, and we'll cover them in the later videos in this series. Now, why is JSX helpful? Because JSX allows you to embed JavaScript code inside your JSX code or React components. Now, for example, you have some JSX code in a React component, and you might want to render something depending on a condition. So you can just embed some JavaScript code, maybe an if statement or a ternary operator, in the JSX, and then just render some code or render some JSX depending on a condition. Or like you could literally run a for loop inside the JSX code and then just render a list or something. Now, the last thing we need to know about is component lifecycle. So component lifecycle is basically just a set of events that happen when your React page is being viewed. So for example, a few of the events is, for example, when the component is mounted onto the page. That's an event. So it's these are like basically events of the component's life. So for example, when a component is mounted, when a component is rendered, when a component is updated, or like whenever a component is removed, etc, etc. So these are basically all like the most basic React concepts that you need to know in order to get started using React and making your front-end applications. Now let's talk about some prerequisites, or like the stuff that you need to do or know in order to start learning React. The first thing you need to know is, you guessed it, JavaScript fundamentals. Since React is a JavaScript library, you must know how to use JavaScript, at least on the front-end side. Node is not really important here, but at least how to use vanilla JavaScript. Maybe like you should know how functions work, if statements, loops, data types, etc. in JavaScript. Then you need to know some JavaScript object-oriented programming along with classes, because like when you create React components, you can create React components in two ways, functions and classes. We'll be discussing this later. And so you should know classes, and then you need to also know objects, because you might want to store objects in your state, key pair values, hash maps, and you might also make an API request, a JSON API request, and then the JSON data will be in the form of objects, so you need to know how those work. Now the third thing you need to know, and it's not necessary for like a beginner, but once you're like starting to get experience with React, you might want to know API requests and promises. So API requests are very important since React is a client-sided library. There isn't like a direct way to communicate or render data from the backend. So for example, when you have a website written in PHP or Flask, when the client makes a request to the server, it just renders the page on the server side with all of the data from the database or the backend. But since React is client-sided, there isn't a way for it to like get data from the backend. So for this, your backend might want to run a WebSocket or an HTTP server, and then or like a GraphQL server, and then you could just use React to make an API request to the server, store the response in the state, and then render that from the state. Now promises are a very important part in HTTP requests. Promises are like basically like futures. So if you have experience with asynchronous programming, promises are like futures. So basically a promise is just a representation that the asynchronous function, which is like the fetch function, hasn't finished running yet, so you're still waiting for the data. So that's why when we make API requests, we're going to be using async await, and that's why promises are a necessary concept. Now, the fourth thing you need to know is destructuring objects. Now this is a really basic thing. I don't know why I put it there, maybe to make the list a bit longer, but even a noob can destructure objects. Basically, for example, you have an object called x, okay? And when you're rendering something on a React page or using it in a function, you don't want to do x.y, x.z, like not like that. Like you don't want to like always just access the like objects properties one by one. So what you can do is you can destructure the objects and just access the values or properties individually. So instead of doing like for object x, you do x.y, x.z. Instead of doing this, you could just destructure the object x and just directly call y or z as the values. Now the fifth thing that you need to know, and this is like probably like the most basic thing that you need to know, is HTML and CSS. Yes, since React is a web library or web framework, you need to know HTML and CSS in order to make front-end apps. You cannot expect to just write JavaScript, and I don't think anyone learns front-end JavaScript without knowing HTML and CSS first, because the only thing you're going to be doing with front-end JavaScript is just manipulating the HTML and CSS, nothing else. So yeah, those two are necessary, and then the last thing you need to do is you should be willing to give time and effort to learn it. React is like, it's the same for all programming or technologies, is that you need to be willing to give time and effort in order to learn it, because you can't just learn a whole library or framework and master it in one day. You need to learn like everything and then just practice them. So like for example, you watch someone's tutorial, okay, you saw a tutorial, the guy made something, and now you might want to use the same concept the guy used and then just make something similar to that but in your own way. So in that way, it's like you just practiced what you just learned like in a tutorial, so I hope it explains it. So yeah, these were like just the slides. I hope I didn't bore you. And now let's get started with installing Node.js and creating a React project. So open up your browser and go to node.js.org. This is the Node.js homepage, and we'll be downloading Node.js from here. So if you already have Node.js installed, please skip to this timestamp because I don't want to waste your time. So over here for the download section, you can download for your operating system. I'm on Windows, so I can download either the long-term support version or the current version. But the long-term support version is recommended for most users, but I want to install the latest version. So you click the download and then it starts to download it. Once you have downloaded Node.js, double-click the installer and it will open up the Node.js setup wizard. Now, first thing you do is click next, and then just read through this and then accept the license agreement. And then you can install Node.js to the default directory, or you can change it, but I'll keep it in the default directory. Click next, and then just keep it as it is. No need to change any one of these. Now click next, and I don't think you need to install Chocolatey, but Chocolatey is like a really good software manager or modules for Windows, but I don't want to install Chocolatey. But if you want, you could install it. I'll click next, and now it'll start installing. Now this will ask for administrator, so you can just click yes and then let it install. So once it has finished installing, you could click finish, and now we can open up our terminal and install a Node.js package called Create React App. Now, Create React App is a package that will basically bootstrap or just generate a simple React project for us. So if we wanted to like manually create a React project, that would be really hard, since you have to like initialize Babel and also install Webpack, set up React compiler, React scripts, React DOM. It's really complicated. So to make our lives easier, we'll be using a Node.js package called Create React App. So open up your terminal in your folder or anywhere, and now we could run a Node.js command, or more like the npm command. So once you install Node.js, the Node Package Manager, or npm, will be installed by default. So you could do npm install -g create react app, and now hit enter, and this will start installing the Create React App package, and it is really quick. So now let's create a really simple React project using Create React App. So we can do something like npx create react app, and then we could give it a name of our project. So I could do to-do list, since this is the project that we'll be creating in this series. Now if you want to use TypeScript, you could just add -- TypeScript, but TypeScript just adds a lot of complexity if you're just a beginner. So let's just create it, let's just keep it normal JavaScript. Now hit enter, and this will start creating that simple React project for you, and as you can see, it has popped up. Now since I have Yarn installed, which is like another Node third-party package manager, it's using Yarn. But if you don't have Yarn installed, it will use npm, which is fine as well. And as you can see, it has created a simple React project for us. So we could just run the following commands: cd to-do list, and then just run npm start. So you only run npm start if you don't have Yarn installed, but I have Yarn installed, and Create React App detected Yarn, so I have Yarn start, but you can just run npm start as well. So let's run Yarn start, and this should run the development server and give us a basic React app. And as you can see, this is a really simple React app which is created by Create React App. Now if you want to learn React, you can also check out the React documentation. It also has like a text-based tutorial over here. You can learn React like this. And as you can see, the React DevTools plugin also detects that this is the development version of React, which is because this is just a development server. Now, in the next video, we'll be talking about how we could just modify this React app, and then we will also try to set up a really simple project. Now, we'll just delete all the boilerplate code that create React app as generated for us, and then we'll start creating the to-do list app and then just go over all of the concepts. So anyways, I hope this video was helpful to you, and if it was, make sure to subscribe to my channel and like this video, and you can also put a dislike if you don't like it. So anyways, have a nice day, and I'll see you in the next video.